Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Heart Hook Home Video Crochet Podcast series. It's kind of a mouthful. This is Ashley here, and we are going to discuss everyone's favorite topic when it comes to crochet, which is gauge. I know this is not a very exciting topic, but it is so very important when it comes to crocheting and making something that turns out to be the size that it is intended to be. So I have a list here of all of the things that I want to make sure to cover because there are so many different aspects of gauge. That's why I also wanted to do this very early on in the podcast series because this is something that is very important. I do have a full tutorial on gauge, how to measure it, how to adjust it, etc. on hearthookhome.com. I'll put a link to that in the description below. First of all, we're going to talk about what is gauge, why do we want to check it, how to check it, right? And how to adjust your hook size so that you can match mine or any other designer. It doesn't have to be me. The stitch pattern that you use and adjusting for a different size of yarn. So if you want to use a yarn that is a slightly thinner yarn than mine or a slightly larger yarn than mine, as long as you're using a Heart Hook Home pattern, typically there is a way that you can use a different size yarn and still have your project turn out to be the correct size. We're also going to talk about how to figure out how large a project will be if you're going to wing it and you're going to just use a stitch by yourself, how to make a gauge swatch and use that information inside of that gauge swatch to math it out to figure out how wide your project would be if you say used 100 stitches. How wide is that going to end up being? If you want a blanket that's going to be 48 inches wide, you need to know how to do that math, and it is super simple. So we are going to dive straight into the wonderful world of crochet gauge today. It's going to be amazing. Get excited. Okay, so first and foremost, what is gauge? Gauge, technically speaking, is the size of your crochet stitch compared to the size of mine. So in my patterns, or any really pattern of crochet, you're going to see a gauge listed. So they're gonna say typically in 4 inches, you'll have this many stitches, right? And so if you have a lot more than that, you have too many, your stitches are too small. They need to be bigger. And if you have a lot less than that, right? So if I have 10 and you only have 6, that means that yours are way too big and they need to be a little bit smaller so that you can also have the same number that I have, right? So you're trying to meet gauge, and that's why we say that we are meeting gauge. So when you're making, especially wearables like cardigans or anything that you actually physically put on your body, those are mathed out. That's what I call it. So that, you have this many stitches. The back of your cardigan needs to be this wide. How many stitches do I need in order for the back of this cardigan to be 17 inches or whatever size it is that you're making, right? And that's the designer's job, but it's your job to make sure that you match exactly or as close as possible so that your finished product comes out to be the correct size. So when you're reading a pattern and it says you need to have this many stitches in this many inches, it's typically 4 inches wide by 4 inches tall. And you're going to try to adjust, you're going to make your first gauge swatch, and sometimes there is a gauge swatch pattern included in the pattern, which is a very small, like a tiny little washcloth size that you will crochet up, and then you can use your ruler to measure and say, okay, well, she had 12 and I only have 10. So how are we going to adjust that to make it to where mine is the same size? Okay, so we're going to talk about that too. So now that we know what gauge is, let's talk about why we want to check it, right? And well, I guess we did that too, but it's mostly important for wearables. Like if you are making a blanket, like, does it really matter if your blanket is 1 inch larger than mine? No, it doesn't. And that's another thing is how off can you be before it starts creating issues, right? So typically, I think anywhere between a half a stitch or so. So if I have 10 stitches and you have 11, it's not the end of the world, right? Ideally, you would try to get it down to maybe 10 and a half stitches and as close to that 10 as you possibly can. We'll also talk about the height of the stitches later because that is a super, it's a very common issue that the height of the stitches doesn't match more than the width. It's very easy to get the width correct because the width is actually determined by the shaft of your crochet hook. So these are all of my Clover crochet hooks, the soft touch. These are my favorite crochet hooks. I have a gazillion crochet hooks, but these are my go-to when I'm wanting to work on a project and I'm wanting to crochet it fast and I know that my gauge is always going to be consistent when I use these. Sometimes when I use other brand of hooks, I'm just not as consistent with my gauge, and that is just something that I have learned about myself. And I do think that if you are going to try, speaking of hook sizes, etc., I do think that if you're going to try different brands of hooks, say you want to buy, I don't know, some new hooks from Michael's or Joann's or something that you've never tried before, I would absolutely 100% go home, buy one of them or however many you want, and go home, and I would use the hook that you always use, the one that you are most comfortable with, or maybe the one that you learned on. Maybe it's a super cheap aluminum hook, which is fine, perfectly fine, and it works fine. But if you're trying to, branch out into different hooks or more ergonomic if your wrist is hurting or something like that, I would go home and make a swatch using the regular crochet hook that you always use, and then take that new hook that you just bought and make the exact same thing with the same number of stitches and the same number of rows, and compare them to each other, because it is amazing to see how different your gauge swatches can turn out just by using a different brand of hook, whether it's inline or tapered, which we will probably discuss in a future podcast. But it is amazing how different those sizes can come out just by changing the brand of your hook. So that is something to check as well. Not only are we looking at the hook size, which determines the width of your stitch, but we're looking at the brand as well. So if you are not able to meet the height of a certain stitch, you might try a different brand. I know for me personally, my Clover Soft Touch, I know exactly what my gauge is going to be with these. If I'm using an H hook and worsted weight yarn, it's almost always going to turn out the same, depending on the stitch, of course. But if I switch to like a Furls hook, which is a more ergonomic, the really pretty ones, my stitches are always a bunch taller than they are with these. And that's just something that I know because I sit down and I make up a swatch using my old hook and my new hook, and I'm able to compare those and go from there. So I think that is an excellent way to just kind of, I don't know, to even just to better understand your own skill and your own craft, right? To understand how that is working for you. So how to check gauge. I am going to change my camera angle here so that you can see what I am looking at. So here I have a piece of crochet that I have worked up, and I have my handy dandy little counter here, which is just a ballpoint pen. But we are going to count how many stitches I have in these 4 inches right here. So what you want to do is line up your ruler on the very side of a stitch, and you never want to go on the very outside of the stitch, because these outside turning chains can be slightly different size or structure than the inside here. And that's why it doesn't matter how wide your piece is, you always want to measure inside of those stitches. So start somewhere in the middle here. You're going to line up your ruler edge with the edge, very left edge of one of these stitches. Right? So we're just going to count how many of these stitches we can see until we get to the 4 over here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It's just a tiny little smidge over 15. I'm going to say 15 because these swatches, mine at least, I mean, if you just even do this just a tiny bit, it readjust to where, now we're at 15, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Beautiful, beautiful. So we know that we have 15 stitches here. If we change this so that we're looking at it from this direction, let me move this to a better angle here, we can see that if I start right here, okay, we're going to start at the 4 and count our way up. And you can flip this around if you want to, doesn't matter. So this row right here, this is the top of that row, the back of that row that I'm looking at right here. This would be 1, and this would be 2, this would be 3, this is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It looks like we have almost exactly 10 rows in 4 inches. Right? So we know if you are going to crochet whatever it is that I'm crocheting here, which is actually a basic back loop beanie, you want to have as many stitches as I do. So this right here is 15 stitches and 10 rows. So if you use the hook size that I use, let me pull all my hooks out. If you use the hook size that I use, which for this pattern is an H. If you use this and yours comes out and it is not the same size as mine, say you have 13 stitches instead of the 15 that I have. Your stitches, you have 13 of them, which means that they are too big. You need to make them a little bit smaller so that you can fit 15 in there instead of just the 13 that you have. So if your stitches need to be a little bit smaller, then you need to go from an H down to either, where's my G? To a G. Now, if you have the G plus, which is a 4.5 millimeter, that would work perfectly fine as well. I do not typically use that size. I don't know why, I just don't. So I would go from the H, which is a 5 millimeter, and I would first try this G, which is a 4 millimeter. See if I can get it to that 15 stitches instead of what you had. So that is basically all you're going to do. You're going to crochet another piece. It doesn't have to be as large as this. This is actually a beanie that I'm working on, but it doesn't have to be as large as this. It can be just the 4 or a little bit larger than 4 inches. Like I said, you do not want to count the outside stitches here. So if you leave a couple stitches on the outside, let me move my ruler over. If you leave a couple stitches on the outside and a couple stitches on this side, ideally you want your actual gauge swatch, the piece that you actually crocheted, to be more like 5 inches. Right? To leave room for the outside stitches on each end. So you're going to count only the inside stitches like this and make sure that you have the same number and the same width. All right, so now that we know how to count the stitches in your 4 inches or whatever the gauge swatch is that you're using, now we need to know how to adjust for the height of them, right? So the height actually doesn't have anything to do with the size of the crochet hook that you're using. I mean, it does a little bit, but what you're going to want to do is you're going to first find the correct width of your stitch. So if you need to have 15 stitches and 4 inches, that's what you're going to go for first. That's the first thing you want to meet when you meet gauge, right? And introduce yourself nicely. What you're going to do next, so you're gonna find if I need an H hook and you like, oh great, I have my H hook is also 15, except instead of 10 rows, I have 12. Dang. So that means that your rows are too short. You have too many. They're too short. They need to be taller so that you have fewer of them so that you also have 10 like I do. So what you're going to do with that method, it's called the golden loop method, and I don't know who actually came up with it, but all it is it's where you adjust the height of your stitch by either pulling up that initial loop higher or making it shorter. So if you need that row to be taller, if yours are too short and you need them to be taller, you're gonna pull that initial loop up a little bit taller before you make that yarn over and complete that stitch. Alternately, if you need them to be a little bit shorter, you're going to not pull up that loop as tall so that your stitch isn't as heightened as you normally crochet. So it's honestly quite easy to adjust. It just takes some practice. So first and foremost, find the width of your stitch because that is determined by the shaft of your hook size, the size of the shaft of your hook, I guess. That's kind of complicated to say. But first you're gonna find the width and then you're going to find the height. And you know, what is lovely is if you can find a crochet hook. Say that I'm almost always use my Clover soft touch when I'm crocheting. And so when you find a heart hook home pattern, have confidence that I am using a Clover soft touch when I created that. So if you can find a crochet hook that you know always matches mine for height and width, then say maybe it's a different brand. Maybe you like a boy, maybe you like a anything. Maybe it's a Furls, maybe it's the ergonomic from Prim. I mean, it could be anything. But if you find a hook that you consistently can match mine, then it makes the whole gauge process so much easier. So if you do find a favorite designer, even if it's not me, if you can meet their gauge consistently, as long as they consistently use the same hook size, you theoretically should consistently meet the gauge if you use the one that you know matches theirs, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Next, I want to talk about the stitch pattern. So the stitch pattern is important, and the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because a lot of times I get emails and they say, what stitch am I supposed to use for the gauge pattern or for the gauge swatch, right? When I make a gauge swatch, what stitch am I supposed to use? Is it double crochet? Is it single crochet? Is it half double? Typically, you're going to use the stitch that is in the pattern itself. So like for my Summer Sultan Cardi, I did not check the gauge before I just said that, so I have no idea what it is. But when you do the gauge swatch for that pattern, you're going to want to use the Sultan stitch, which is what is used to make the actual cardigan itself, if that makes sense. So you'll use the stitch, unless otherwise stated, that is used to make the pattern itself. Make up just a small swatch. And you know, when you're doing your gauge swatch, it doesn't have to be perfect. It really doesn't. You're just going to rip it out anyway to start an actual crocheting of the pattern. So you can start with any number of chains and then just kind of crochet the first few rows of the pattern. If there's not a specific gauge pattern included, just crochet the first few rows of the pattern itself. And you don't have to, you know, complete it all the way to the row. If you get to the end of the first row and you've got 3 chains just hanging out there, who cares? You're going to rip it out anyway, right? It doesn't matter. It's no big deal. So that is my number 1 tip. Gauge swatch, it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be an accurate representation of what that hook size is going to give you going forward, right? Easy peasy. So how to adjust for different sizes of yarn. Okay, this one's a big one for me because I frequently get questions about, I want to make the Painted Canyon cardigan, or I want to make the bomber cardigan, or I want to make the velvet cardigan, which is perfectly lovely. It's great. Those are all great patterns. I mean, they're mine. Of course, I think they're great. But if you want the Painted Canyon cardigan specifically is one that I get a lot of questions on. How do I adjust for gauge on this? Because it's made with a worsted weight yarn. And I have made several of them using mandala, which is a size 3, which is a little bit thinner than a worsted weight yarn. It colors beautifully. It has the beautiful, you know, changing of the colors, and it just looks amazing. The specific one that I'm thinking of is the 2-3T size, the one that I made in the original video, which I don't recommend watching actually. It's one of my first videos and it was not a very good one, if we're being completely honest. But that it is just gorgeous. You can see pictures of it. It's the size 2-3T, and my little model was absolutely precious when she was trying it on, and I let her keep it because she was just adorable. I couldn't help it. It's a little rainbow color. But anyway, it's a thinner yarn than what is recommended for the pattern itself. For that pattern, or for that specific cardigan, I just used the same hook size, and it's a little bit more of an open weave because the yarn is thinner, so it's a little bit holier. It's a little bit of a lighter weight cardigan, but it did turn out the same size, right? So one thing that you can do if you are going to use a different size yarn, number 1, I wouldn't generally advise going more than 1 yarn size off from what the pattern suggests. Okay, and keep in mind here that I am specifically talking about my own heart hook home patterns, because I don't want to speak for any other designer, and I mean, you can try it, fine, but speaking specifically for mine. What I tell people to do in this instance, if you are, so the Painted Canyon cardigan has a worsted weight yarn. If you want to use a size 3, which is a baby weight yarn, you are going to go down, first and foremost, you're going to use any worsted weight you have on hand. Any scrap stuff, doesn't matter. Pick something off the wall, just use it. Crochet up the gauge swatch first. Make sure that the hook size that you are using brings out the gauge that I have listed in that pattern. I think it's 11 stitches by 10 rows, but don't quote me on that. But make sure that you can meet that gauge, whether you need an I hook, a J hook, whatever you need. Find the gauge using the worsted weight yarn first. Then, whatever you hook it took you to meet the same gauge as mine, you're going to adjust that for the smaller yarn, okay? So you're going to go down 1 hook size from what it took you to obtain gauge, and you're going to make the size larger in the pattern that you normally would have made. Because if you go down a hook size, your whole thing is going to turn out smaller, right? Because you're going to have different size stitches than mine. So if you go down a hook size, you're going to compensate for that by making a pattern size larger. Alternately, if you are wanting to use a bulky weight yarn, which is a size 5 yarn, you're going to use a hook size that is 1 larger, because your yarn is 1 size larger than the worsted weight, and you're going to make a pattern size 1 smaller, right? And that, I mean, generally speaking, I have tried that with probably a dozen at least of my patterns, and it always turns out perfectly fine, and it always looks great. It feels great. The sizing, if anything, it's usually off by maybe ½ an inch total, like the whole entire thing. So perfectly fine. Try it. Let me know what you think. You could do the gauge swatch, I suppose, but then that would involve a lot more math, and which is fine. Which leads me to our final tip on mathing it out. That's what I call it. Whenever I'm designing something new, I always like to put in my AirPods or turn on my music really loud. And I usually, it's really weird, I'm really into Rihanna or Eminem when I'm designing. I don't know, it's just my thing. It's my ragey music, I guess. Some people put that on when they like to clean. It's my design mathing it out music. So anyway, I turn it up really loud and I just kind of zone out completely. And what I'm doing is I'm mathing out the pattern, right? So as far as designing, I'm not going to go into that in this particular podcast. I do think I will discuss designing more in detail in a future podcast. But my point is if you want to math it out, say that you are going to just wing it and you say, oh my gosh, I just love this stitch. I have to make a blanket in it. How big do I need it to be? How many stitches do I need? What in the heck? You know, how am I going to do this? First things first, make yourself a swatch. The bigger your swatch, the better. So like this one here, this is a good, 12 inches now. And let's see, it's about 12 inches, since I have my handy dandy ruler, it's about 12 inches by 8 inches, okay? So we are going to measure, if you're gonna math it out, you're gonna measure this, okay? The larger the sample, the better. I mean, it doesn't have to be huge. At least 4 inches though, because I wouldn't recommend less than that. Now what you're going to do, if you take this and you say, okay, I've got 10 stitches in 4 inches, okay, that means that each stitch is 0.4 inches big, right? If you got 10 of them in 4 inches. So if you do the math and you've got 10 in 4 inches, that means if you did 100, you'd have 40 inches, right? So it's really not too difficult. If you did 200 stitches, how many inches would that be? 80, right? So it's really not too difficult. That's another question that I get quite often is, how big is this going to be when I'm done? Well, what I do when I'm designing personally, I always make several different gauge swatches to figure out what hook size I want to go with, and if it gives it a good fabric feel, if it's got a good weave to it, if it's too loose or too stiff or too tight, I know that I need to go up several hook sizes to give it more of a flowy vibe, right? So I always try to use several different hook sizes first before I decide on the actual one that I want to use. And then I divide it out. I say, okay, I've got 4 inches and there's 10 stitches in there. So I know that each one is 0.4. And if I need a certain piece, say I'm doing a baby blanket that's 36, right? What would that be? Would that be 90 stitches for a 36-inch baby blanket? So it's just mathing it out, and perhaps I should do that in the description of this video. Actually, just write out the math process that I do. But honestly, it's very simple. It's simple math. It's just basic multiplication, division, and multiplication. And you can easily find out how the finished size of your project will be if you're winging it, just based on a stitch that you found in a stitch dictionary that you like, etc. And then voila, you've made a baby blanket pattern, or you've made a throw pattern, or anything like that. So let's see, did I miss anything? I don't think I did. I hope that this information on gauge, how to check it, how to adjust it, how to adjust the height, how to math it out, as I say. I hope this is helpful to you, and I am very much looking forward to the next episode of the Heart Hook Home Video Crochet Podcast series. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.